This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, California, radio with a choice. This is Mae Brussell. The name of my program is World Watchers, and it is program number 813, July the 6th, 1987. Before we begin the program, I want to say that the views expressed on this show are those of myself and do not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff or their board of directors. We also want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that helps bring you this next hour of World Watchers. The Wall Street Journal had a story about Oliver North today, who will be testifying tomorrow. On page 26, titled Iran-Contra Panel to begin questioning North, focusing on the White House attempts to mislead. And they listed 6 crucial dates from November 20th to 25th. And then there was a subtitle that said November 22nd, smoking gun. And that is the day, of course, that they discovered the memo that had to do with diverting the funds from the Iranian gun sales and weapon sales, the various weapons, to the Contras. It was called November 22nd, the smoking gun. And as I've said so many times on this program, what goes around comes around. And the smoking gun was in Dallas, November 22nd, 24 years ago. It's interesting that Edwin Meese and Ronald Reagan are going to fall down in history on with the same date, and the memo located about Oliver North's activities with the National Security Council and the agencies of the federal government, and the anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy. The Monterey Herald had an article June 27th, 1968, that I've had on the air quite a few times, titled Reagan Aide Studies Extradition Plea, and this had to do with Governor Reagan's top legal advisor, Edwin Meese III, studying whether or not to extradite a man to New Orleans who Jim Garrison accused of having a role in killing John Kennedy. And Edwin Meese III was Reagan's legal advisor in Sacramento, in California in those days. And he protected Edgar Eugene Bradley. Bradley was the West Coast representative for Dr. Carl McIntyre, a radio evangelist charged by Jim Garrison, New Orleans, with conspiracy to assassinate the president on November 22nd, 1963. Carl McIntyre was a very close friend of J. Edgar Hoover. He worked with Domestic Division 5 of the FBI. He worked with Albert Osborne and Oswald's doubles that went into Mexico and played a very major part in the assassination. And Bradley's attorney, George Jensen, argued, or didn't argue hard, to Ronald Reagan that the Warren Commission said Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone in the assassination, and that if Reagan and Meese extradited Bradley to Louisiana, the state would be denying the validity of the Warren Commission. And Ronald Reagan didn't want to do that, and neither did Edwin Meese, so they protected the assassins of John Kennedy from ever coming to court or justice or to effect the change of history. But history caught up with Ronald Reagan, and on November 22nd, 1986, it rolled around on the same day, and it brought Ronald Reagan and Edwin Meese to the point where they are today. Now, several times on this broadcast, I have mentioned a visit I had with a Dr. Walsh in Beverly Hills on Bedford Drive, who was 30 years with the Mayo Clinic, who had seen over 50 heads of state, including Charles de Gaulle and Torrijos, and very many of them. He was the only American psychologist to see Rudolf Hess at Spandau Prison. And when Reagan became president, he had an interview in the LA Times that I've cited before, and it's more pertinent now than ever, that Reagan was a dangerous person. He wasn't mentally fit to be president. He had deficiencies of the brain. He wanted to bring bayonets to the UCLA campus. And now it seems more important than ever to bring in those white coats and examine Ronald Reagan to see his mental state as he brings us to the brink of World War III. When Reagan became president, he said at a time of debate with Jimmy Carter, when the question came up of possible senility, he offered that he would submit to mental tests if he got senile or out of touch, but the person who is out of touch doesn't know it, and it's up to the American people to recognize a very sick person when they have one. The president has had 2 cancer operations. He grows tumors every year. We're told they're benign, but he has the capacity to keep growing them continuously. He has medications, and those can affect his mind and his rationale. If he is potentially a dying person, he'll do things differently than if he thinks he has longevity to enjoy and sit back for the things that he would have accomplished. He can't be interviewed off the cuff. Everything he says is rehearsed. And while we know his speeches were on 3x5 cards before, I understand that at the summit in Venice, I read that even in a private meeting with Margaret Thatcher, he read cards that he could not even remember what to say among the proximity of his closest friends. He allowed 9 days for the summit, so what he had, what he called jet lag, wouldn't be effective going there and coming back. And yet it was revealed that Howard Baker, the chief of staff, kept poking him or giving him cold water and waking him up. He slept through the Venice summit. He diverted the topic last year because he couldn't have conversation last year and had just bombed Libya and diverted the economic summit in Japan to the subject of Libyan violence and the Berlin disco, which Gaddafi didn't bomb. And this year he all of a sudden came up with the Persian Gulf event with Iraq shooting part of our ship, the Stark, USS Stark. Then he went to the summit with another agent provocateur subject that the Allies didn't relate to. It was an economic summit, and he diverted again from the business of state. This year, when the Iraq missile, the airplane, hit the USS Stark, he appeared within hours and blamed Iran for the attack, totally out of contact with reality, and he offered immediately to put American flags on Kuwait ships and make a decision to side with Iraq in a war where he's been defending himself in the Iranian initiative because he wanted to be friends with Iran. He shows no anger at anybody for the Iran-Contra affair. He doesn't act as if he was deceived, and yet he said there ain't no smoking gun. I didn't know anything. He is absolutely emotionless and has a grin similar to other patsies in events who've been doctored up and played a role, such as Sirhan, or Mr. Artie Bremer, or Son of Sam. A lot of these people that are brought in, he's not he is a mass killer in a sense of what he does, but he has this grin that nothing is happening and nothing's bothering him, and he says, I'm not involved, but my people who got me into this are heroes, they're my best friends. And that isn't the normal reaction to people who have purposely deceived you. He said everything was legal, yet he was using surreptitious means so that he wouldn't be detected breaking the Boland Amendment. He's not worried about national security, which is what the president should be worried about. He went to the National Security Agency and commended them for not having leaks. And simultaneously, we learned that Ollie North was taking secret devices from the NSA and giving secret papers that were not to leave this country to Ayatollah Khomeini, and Reagan wasn't even disturbed about the breach in national security. He allowed Mr. Thomas Green, the attorney, to go to the Justice Department and tell them to stay away from the Miami investigation. At the time, he said he was representing General Secord and Albert Hakim and Oliver North, all three. One private individual, one retired general, and one on the staff of the National Security Agency. And by stopping the investigation in Miami, he put a lid on the drug dealing, gun running, and the heavily financed narcotics into this country, while his wife Nancy has a campaign about drugs, Just Say No. He's tangled with the major drug dealers and has halted their investigations. So the man is very sick about this policy, and it will haunt him. It will continue being exposed. He's prided himself in the fact that the best way to govern is to relegate to private individuals the decision-making because they're knowledgeable on these facts. He's laid back, hands off, and he had a cover article in Fortune magazine about how this process works. Yet when he decided to put American flags on the Kuwait ships, his many people from the Navy, from the Army, except for Caspar Weinberger, of course, from the CIA, from the GOP, his own party, were against flagging the Kuwait ship. So at this point, he doesn't use what he calls the best minds. He says, I'm putting them on anyway. I'm going to make the decision after he says I've relegated these decisions to other people. As far as Iran goes, the President of the United States has changed his story so many times that it is perfectly obvious the man is sick. He said he wanted close ties with them because it's geopolitical, the strategy of Iran being so close to Russia. We need them as an ally. And then we find out now that he's ready to send a provocative bomb or missile or two over to Iran to wipe out the weapons they bought from China and possibly start World War III. He said he was working with moderates for when Khomeini gets out, and he was working with members of the Savak, the Shah's deadly team, similar to the Gestapo in Germany. And he's working with, and his people met with those very persons who held the Americans hostage for over a year, 52 Americans. On one hand, he wants to open a dialogue, and then we find out that there's documents and material that Ollie North and the team were actually planning to kill Khomeini and kill top Iranians, and they were sending weapons there for that purpose. All of this keeping peace in the Middle East, not siding with Iran or Iraq, sending our ships there on a moment's notice, is a sign that the head of state is not the head of state. And as I say, it's time to bring in the white coats. When Iraq attacked our ship, he immediately blamed Iran. He immediately said, we will go on the side of Kuwait and protect them while they give Iraq, the country that bombed us, their oil. And Albert Hakim said he had presidential approval, national security approval, to go to Kuwait and get their 17 prisoners released. The 17 people killed one American and bombed the American embassy. So he's rewarding them against Iran, the country he said he wanted to get along with. Now, this is a cornered animal. He's old and he's cornered and he's sick. All of his agencies are on the defensive, the CIA, the Defense Department, the National Security Council, the National Security Agency. He's so much on the defensive, he brought in Frank Carlucci as the National Security Advisor, a partner with Eric von Marburg, a key player in all of this, von Marburg, a part of Stanford Technology Training Group, with Edwin Wilson and Frank Turpel and Thomas Kleins and Theodore Shackley. So the person guarding the president for the National Security Council is himself involved in business deals through the year and with sending weapons from the Defense Department to arm Gaddafi, the great terrorist that Reagan consumed so much time about last year. He's cornered by the fact that not his associates, not members of the GOP, there's 97 of them under investigation, but his closest family are under legal investigation at the present time. Michael Deaver, Edwin Meese, and Lynn Nofziger. These people going back to his early days in California. His close associate, William Clark, has taken a powder. He hasn't been visible, seen, or heard from. His family's not around, and his best friends have special prosecutors. They can't trust the Attorney General, and the Attorney General's under investigation himself for all of these matters. So when a person sees his close associates possibly going to jail, losing their savings or their homes, and then his working associates from the National Security Council, Robert McFarlane, Admiral Poindexter, and Oliver North, committing literally treason against this country and planning the overthrow of this country, the elimination of the Constitution that I'll get to in a minute. This is an animal that will do anything. And our biggest problem now is to make sure that those flags, we can't do it, but people in Washington should watch the flags on the Kuwait ships. Right now, the chief of staff is somewhat backing down. We'll get out of the Gulf if Russia gets out of the Gulf. And the Soviet Union knows, I'm sure, that they're dealing with a crazy man. He also knows that his vice president, the former CIA director, hasn't been involved in any of this material. I mentioned last week he's immune from inquiry. Nobody points fingers at him. He worked as the director of the CIA. So as Reagan's people all get cornered, George Bush attended all the NSC meetings. In some way, it must be scary to have your vice president so immune while everybody talks about what did he know. Not what did they know, but what did he know. And Mr. Gregg, George Bush's aide from the CIA and from Vietnam, and Chichi Quintero and Max Rodriguez, all this gang worked with George Bush and are involved with cocaine traffic. But nobody on the Iran-Contra hearing is pointing a finger at George Bush or even mentioning his criminal activity in Iran or in South America or his connections. And he blew a lot of cases down in Miami by exposing to the media drug profiteers a day before they were to be arrested. So putting the American flag on the ship is very dangerous. There are a couple of other matters that also make it dangerous. One is Reagan's Armageddon complex. He has worked with Jerry Falwell at least 6 years with the Defense Department, planning and believing that the beginning of the end of the world will happen in the Middle East, and he sincerely believes this and belongs to a cult group, one or two, that does, so that putting ships in the Middle East is a biblical prophecy, and he can go down as a good Christian, if not a good president. And he also has had a fixation on Franklin Roosevelt. If you read his biography and articles about him, he always envisioned himself a commander-in-chief. I've mentioned this before. He always envisioned a third term, I guess even sitting in a wheelchair, and he would sail into a national security situation at the time of war where if we criticized him or his friends, we would be aiding and abetting the enemy. So he could cancel 1988 elections. He is the president. He can do what he wants, and the network is there for him, and if he's crazy enough, he can do it, and if we don't recognize his symptoms, then we all have to be as crazy as he is. Now, Elliot Abrams, the Assistant Secretary of State, testified that Ollie North envisioned Alamo-style battles fighting in Nicaragua, that he would sacrifice and have killed many of his Contra persons working with him, and in return it would influence public opinion and pull the United States into a war in Central America. The Christic Institute suit mentions the fact that the defendants in that suit, part of the secret team, wanted to kill the U.S. ambassador, Louis Tams, in Costa Rica, and blame Nicaragua for that as a chance to invade Nicaragua. Getting rid of Louis Tams, who as ambassador in Colombia, didn't like the cocaine traffic and moved to Costa Rica, where the Medellin cocaine traffickers were continuing their operation from Colombia through Costa Rica, and it would be convenient to unload this far-right winger, get the sympathy of the people seeing him sacrifice and invade Nicaragua. So the Persian Gulf incident could be just a setup, exactly like the kind they were planning in Costa Rica or in Nicaragua, to sacrifice their own as a chance that then we can get a full-scale war going. Now, there was an editorial yesterday in the San Jose Mercury, no case against Robert Bork. And the editorial says that you can't restrict the appointment of Robert Bork, this is their opinion, on the Supreme Court on the grounds of ideology. And then they mention, and all of you know, as U.S. Solicitor General in 1973, Bork obeyed Richard Nixon's order to fire the special prosecutor at the time of Watergate, Archibald Cox, and Elliot Richardson and William Ruckelshaus, the Attorney General and Deputy Attorney General, resigned rather than carry out their orders. And the San Jose Mercury calls attention that if the Senate confirms Ronald Reagan's nomination of Bork to the Supreme Court, Bork could conceivably help undercut the authority of special prosecutors investigating various Reagan associates like Deaver and Mies and Nofziger and the Iran-Contra scandal. And the editorial says, go ahead and have Bork in anyway, even if he has the capacity to end all criminal investigations. Now, this country is so far gone that it defies logic to believe that an editorial writer from the San Jose Mercury believes, let Reagan have his quick appointment of Bork and cancel all investigations because if he's the president, he doesn't have to be investigated. That's going pretty far along. And, of course, this last weekend there were articles, Reagan seeks quick confirmation of Bork. Why not? There was a syndicated column last week by Richard Reeves on Edwin Meese titled, Kick Out Meese First, Then Name Your Justice of the Supreme Court. And he said, if it sounds like I believe President Reagan's constitutionally proper Supreme Court nominee should be held hostage to politics, that is exactly what I believe. What are we paying this bum for, this Edwin Meese? Besides paying Meese his salary, we have to keep paying for special prosecutors for the crimes he committed that have been appointed because he's under criminal questioning, either by himself and find either evidence or another rationale to say our Attorney General didn't actually or knowingly violate the law. We have these prosecutors, and this is from the New York Times and San Jose Mercury and other papers. Get rid of Meese. He's barred from looking into attempted military intelligence coup called Irangate because he was in on the planning of it all along. He's barred from doing anything about WedTech because he made money off the scam or could be making. He's barred from investigating the Teamsters because of his close relationship to Mafia, Jackie Presser, and it goes on and on. And then the San Francisco Examiner had an article just yesterday, which I call Photo Opportunity, that this administration loves. And there is an American flag being held up, and there's a U.S. envoy and Abul Fattah el-Badr from Kuwait. And it says, House members, Kuwaitis, discussed the reflagging. And they made a point that the United States delegation, Representative Larry Hopkins, Republican of Kentucky, gave an American flag to Abul Fattah el-Badr, the chairman of Kuwait Petroleum Shipping, at a 4th of July ceremony, as if Kuwait and the Abdul believes the 4th of July is important. And it was at the United States Embassy in Kuwait. And the flag, which once flew over the United States Capitol, will be used on the first Kuwait oil tanker that will get U.S. Navy protection. And by all accounts, the CIA and other estimations, it could begin a shooting war. Nothing less than the flag from the United States Capitol. America doesn't have enough flags to give around, but the symbolism, it comes from Washington to Kuwait, and the message is save my ass, get the shooting going so I can get off the hook. I'm sending you my own flag from the United States Capitol. That's the way I speak Reaganese, and I understand Ronald Reagan. Now, the news accounts this weekend, were filled with stories about the martial law plan that Reagan had, and I'm going over that article at length with you, actually for the remainder of the program, and the material that's in there, because it is, in essence, the entire Reagan story, or an overview of it, of what's going on ever since he's been president, or wanted to run in 1980. The article's titled North and the Secret Government, Martial Law Plan Among the Work of Reagan Advisors. The date is July the 5th, 1987. It's written by Alfonso Ciardi. It was published in the Miami Herald and San Jose Mercury, and sections were on the Wire service. And this goes into Reagan and some documents that have existed for a long time but are coming to attention now because they connect to Ollie North. The article says that a martial law plan was drafted in 1984. It would impose martial law in the United States in the event of emergency. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North helped with the 1984 plans. Attorney General William French Smith was opposed to this. And as I read sections, I've outlined sections of the article, I had to intersperse my translation as we go along. Ollie North didn't create a 1984 plan. He updated it. The martial law plan was in effect at the time of the conventions, Republican conventions in 1972. It was part of Squad 19 of Louis Tackwood. It was a plan to even kill Richard Nixon and make Spiro Agnew president of the United States, with the CIA and the Greek military junta and the powers that be in Washington working this one out, the martial law plan. The only reason we didn't have it in 1972 was because the men were caught at the Watergate Hotel in June, and the convention wasn't until later in the summer, and the money that they had tied directly to the banks of people supplying guns and weapons for the demonstrations that would create the incidences that would cause martial law. Ronald Reagan put this together when he was governor of California. From 1966 to 74, it was called the Garden Plot. He worked with Edwin Meese in Military Reserve. What he did as president was just update it, but he always had it on the plans. And the 1984 date is useful because of the Olympic Games, and I had done a lot of research on the fact that if the Russian athletes had come here, all the machinery was ready for a coup in 1984. The article continues, the Constitution would be suspended. Control of the government would go to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Appointed military commanders would run the state and local governments. Martial law would be declared in the event of nuclear war, violent or widespread internal dissent, or if there was a national opposition to a U.S. military invasion abroad. And, of course, when Reagan came in, the very first National Security Council meeting involved Libya and it involved Iran. And he had on his mind going into Nicaragua and putting the Somozans back in power, taking the Marshall Islands, controlling the Philippines if the Marcoses got out of hand, going into Panama, Afghanistan, and any one of these operations, if there was opposition at home, the Reagan saw during the Vietnam War under Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, then martial law could be called, and Ollie North was creating the incidences with the TWA, the Kili Laura, the Pakistan hijacking, the Turkey bombing, the gunning in the synagogue. There were endless violences that I believe were agent provocateur out of Reagan, the Berlin disco. And then as he takes his military step, which we didn't mind when he took the poor little island of Grenada, we sat down like little tame animals and let him take it. If there had been opposition, he may have made one of the moves then, but we sat back and said, it's all yours, and you can have the island, you're great. And that was planned by Oliver North and Admiral Poindexter and Robert McFarland, the same team. The article says Colonel Oliver North's proposal and involvement was a proposal to radically alter American government by executive order in a time of crisis. And it is evidence he was involved in a wide range of secret foreign affairs, domestic affairs, far beyond the Iran-Contra affair. Life magazine has an interview with his wife, Betsy. Don't you understand what communism is? He's a patriot, he's a Christian, and everybody should be behind him. She doesn't balance, and neither does Life magazine, the next issue, the fact that he wanted to alter the American government and erase the Constitution. This is his version of Americanism to put us in a position like Korea or the Philippines under Marcos or under Pinochet in Chile, and the military dictatorships that we've put around the world are coming closer to our door. The North executive order that would have been signed didn't even need actually the president's signature. The way he wrote up the Constitution, it didn't need his signature. It was Executive Order 11490 that was put together for the president to sign, but the conditions were that we could have the coup by the colonels, the comparison of the Algerian colonels, that we came close to having this several times in this administration already, but he had the papers, or they had the papers. North was paid by the Marines. He worked at the National Security Council. He worked with Robert McFarland from the Navy, an admiral from Annapolis. It was a military plan. It wasn't North's plan. And the emphasis is, what is North going to do? It was a plan from the National Security Council, which was set up to get rid of Congress anyway and take the decisions from Congress. He was simply a person working for them. The article says North was at the center of what amounted to a secret government within a government, according to Arthur Lyman, the chief counsel of the Senate committee. How could North be the center of anything that Reagan and Meese and the Defense Department planned 15 years ago? To make him the center is to make Hitler responsible for World War II, or Lee Harvey Oswald responsible for the whole Kennedy assassination. North understood the terms that he'd be the fall guy if it ever came down. He knew that, and he'll be a millionaire and he'll be a hero. So all the committees are fingering North and letting everybody else off the hook. As I say, he has to be the Lee Oswald, James Earl Ray, Artie Bremer, Sirhan fall guy of this story. And to top it off, Albert Hakim testified that Ollie North had a death wish. He would like to die for his country. He wanted nothing better than to die. So if they off him, or if he's suicidal, or they take him somewhere and he jumps out of the window like Bethesda, they could say that is what he always wanted. So he's willing to be the fall guy, but they're ready to kill him, and die for your country is part of the testimony that is fait accompli. It's been said, so you have no more surprises in the event that that would happen. Arthur Lyman, the chief counsel, said that before the hearings began, he expected to show that a foreign policy decision was made at the highest level to transfer U.S. support of the Nicaraguan Contras to the National Security Council, where North operated. Lyman, chief Senate counsel, said we favor examining how that decision was implemented to support the Contras from the NSC. Well, Lyman and Simon Rifkin, his law partner, lawyer represent Robert Vesco, one of the most important persons, the whole social fabric of America. Arthur Lyman knows how these decisions are made, and so does Simon Rifkin. They've been in the middle of this all along, but they want to divert it to what was North's mind, and they want to say, this is a quotation, that the story will reveal the whole secret government within a government operated at the executive office building by a lieutenant colonel. So when he testifies this week and you hear him watch the camera zoom on the lieutenant colonel, and Lyman says they had their own army, Air Force, diplomatic agents, intelligence activities, and appropriations. Appropriations means funds. And Ollie North tapped into the Credit Suisse in Switzerland to Permindex money that overthrew the administration when Kennedy was president. I'll take a 1-minute break and go back to the appropriations. Arthur Lyman knows better. He's a brilliant lawyer, and it'll be a good show. But it's not the whole show, and they're zooming in only on the president and Oliver North. Now, in the 1-minute break I'm taking, I want to remind you that at the end of this hour, you get to call in and talk about what you're hearing. And last week we talked about what you're feeling about all of this. I think it's important to know if people are responding emotionally or at a gut level about some of these convoluted things that are happening. And I'm wanting to hear from you and see if you're, of course, those of you who can will be watching the testimony all week. This is Mae Brussell, in case you picked it up in the middle of World Watchers. I'm talking about an article in the Miami Herald this past Sunday, North and Secret Governments. It was in the San Jose Mercury also, and it's the zooming in of the Iran-Contra people into the hearings coming up and the fact that Ollie North and the White House were part of a secret government that planned to overthrow the United States government. Now, Arthur Lyman, again, was talking about the appropriations that these people had. They use Willard Zucker, and Arthur Lyman knows him well. He's a business partner of Robert Vesco, and Arthur Lyman and Simon Rifkin, his law partners, represent Robert Vesco. So they're all in this web together. The appropriations came from the Galen operation, from Otto von Borschwing out here in Palo Alto, and from the very persons working with Ronald Reagan when he was governor out here for 8 years, getting the Garden Plot going and martial law put into place. And money came from the Vatican and the P2, and from Michael Ledeen as head of the Italian SISMI, and unlimited money from Italian intelligence and the P2 Lodge, the secret lodge that was effecting a military dictatorship in Spain when it was exposed. And the CIA Defense Department have what they call black money, unlimited money sequestered away. So the appropriations aren't hard to figure out. Ollie North and that team got Air Force and diplomatic agents and intelligence activities and airplanes and ships. They could get anything they want because this has been going on since World War II, and the profits from the drug traffic have accumulated so they can do more of what they want than they could ever do before. Now, Alphonse Chardy says that North helped draft the plan which would impose martial law. He served in the National Security Council, and while he served in the National Security Council, he was liaison to the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Now, Jack Anderson did a lot of articles on FEMA, and I have many, many files on it. But September 1st, September the 7th, and September 9th, 1984, he called his articles Disaster Planning, Federal Government Takeover, Lust for Power, and another article called Martial Law Plan, and another Military Dictatorship. And he said the Federal Emergency Management Agency is controlled by Director Louis Giuffrida, Giuffrida, who likes to be called General. He's a general. He formerly headed the California National Guard Training Center when Ronald Reagan was governor. The general, as Giuffrida is called, was brought to Washington by the old National Guard buddy of his, White House counselor Edwin Meese, the same one who wouldn't extradite Edgar Eugene Bradley. Giuffrida and Meese are very close, and Jack Anderson's articles go into the danger of a military dictatorship of these people working together. And also this article says, and I quoted before, that Attorney General William French Smith was opposed to the plan. He was onto the plan in 1984. The documents reveal that he was afraid of a military dictatorship. The Washington Post had a story September 3rd, 1984, Smith accuses the Federal Emergency Management Agency of a grab for power, that they want to be equivalent of a czar in this country, an emergency czar, that they were working with Robert McFarlane, the National Security Council, and it was a threat to the United States. FEMA was created in 1979, but it was the old garden plot that Reagan put together up to 1974 when he wasn't governor. It was formed in California and then moved nationally with Reagan and Meese to Washington, D.C., where the executive order for taking over the government would happen. But William French Smith was the Attorney General up till 1984 when Reagan was in and was aware of this. And what did he do? He very nicely resigned and gave the whole agency to the new Attorney General, Edwin Meese, who worked with FEMA, who worked with the Garden Plot, the Marshall Law Plan. So instead of watching Washington and staying in Washington to make sure nothing happened, he went out to Rockwell International to practice law in California and represents the very aerospace industry that will build Star Wars or spaceships and continue the military profits of a military takeover by the generals. Bulk of his income, I should say, comes from his affiliations with Rockwell International. So he came home to make the profits, and he turned the whole system over then to the new Attorney General Edwin Meese, who never should have had that job and was under all kinds of investigations that he passed over, as did these other appointments of Ronald Reagan's. So opposing William French Smith isn't enough when he walked away and handed it to them, to the gang. It was in August of 1984 when Smith expressed fear that this emergency czar was created. But William French Smith comes from California, and he didn't mind the Garden Plot. He didn't mind the Operation Chaos, the COINTEL, the MK Ultra, the hell that was California when Reagan was governor for 8 years, and he was an attorney in California affiliated with Ronald Reagan. He knew what they were planning, and so he comes out looking like the clean guy. There are no clean guys in this, but he said, I sent a memo to Robert McFarlane. I didn't like it. And look how long it took to catch on that this was linked to Oliver North and all these people. Alphonse Chardy says in his article, the contingency plan was being written as part of an executive order. It was a package that would be signed and held in the National Security Council. In the event a crisis arose, it would be ready. And from 1983 to 1986, Oliver North's office in the old executive office building adjacent to the White House has been the heart of informal secret structure involved in far more than the sale of arms to Iran and the war to Nicaragua. The reason that Fawn Hall said she worked so hard, she worked 12 hours, and Oliver North worked around the clock, and his wife never saw them, was that they did the NSC job from 8 to 4. Then when everyone else left the old executive office building, these termites could get in, these rats, and run around and plan their covert operations and their military coups and their shenanigans and working with these drug dealers and go home at midnight exhausted and come back the next day because they had 4 hours more or 6 hours, to work on the surreptitious things that nobody in the old executive office building might hear or know, things like the TWA hijacking of the Killed Laura incident and other incidences. Ollie North worked with those terrorists in the Middle East. The article said North's influence was so great within the structure that he was able to have the orbits of sophisticated surveillance satellites, now listen closely, altered to follow Soviet ships around the world. He could call for the launching of high-flying spy aircraft on secret missions over Cuba and Nicaragua and become involved in sensitive domestic activities. That's what Alfonso Chardy wrote. But take another view. Remember the satellite, the spaceship Challenger that circled over the KAL as Larry McDonald, the president of Western Goals, went from Alaska into the Soviet territory to test the response of the Soviet Union as we entered their territory with the Korean pilot, and he went into the ocean, and Oliver North in the administration was writing the response to the Soviet blowing up our plane that could have caused the World War III that they had on the books for the Marshall Law Plan. We had a surveillance satellite. We actually had our spaceships orbiting, exactly timing over the KAL as it was sinking on the ground, and that notorious Larry McDonald, president of the Birch Society, was wiped out. And then Carl Spitz Chanell became head of the John Birch Society, the Western Goals in Washington, D.C., and Chanell was the first to plead guilty in this whole Iran affair so he wouldn't have to go to court. And the administration used the KAL as they wanted the Alamo attack or killing Louis Tams. And the story of this administration is the Korean airline. It is yet to come. And he had the capacity to send surveillance satellites to follow Soviet ships flying over Cuba, Nicaragua, go for the islands over Korea, and going into the Soviet Union, go for those ones. They were monitoring those. And the sensitive domestic activities involved Larry McDonald, Western Goals, Carl Spitz Chanell, and moving the operations officially, although the offices were in the East, into the hands of Spitz Chanell and Ollie North. This article says that Reagan's secret government was put together by his closest friends and advisors, including former National Security Advisor William Clark, the late CIA Director William Casey, and Attorney General Edwin Meese, where they had informal secret structure meetings, and congressional investigators are going into them. Well, Clark came from California. He was in military intelligence and brought Helene von Damm to the TCI Corporation, Transcomputer International, headed by Mr. John Paul Getty, a well-known lover of Adolf Hitler, who had been with Hitler, a person with a fondness for the Nazi regime. I read this week that Carl Spitz Chanell also admired Adolf Hitler. I mentioned last week Premier Key with General Westmoreland, another lover of Adolf Hitler. Clark brought Helene von Damm, he was in military intelligence, to California, where she worked for Otto von Borschwing of the Waffen-SS while she worked for Ronald Reagan. She was 8 years with both of them, the translators simultaneously. She went on to become ambassador to Vienna. Von Borschwing was running operations in Sacramento and in Palo Alto that took and assisted Reinhard Gehlen's activities in the United States. This secret team that came to Washington was the team that worked with Reagan in California and brought their disease and their problems to Washington, D.C. This article continues. Congressional investigators and current and former officials consulted for this article included members of the CIA, the State Department, the Pentagon, who do not have a full record from the beginning to the end of the secret government. Well, I suggest they get Operation Sunrise and see what Allen Dulles was doing in 1943 in Bern, Switzerland, and how Otto von Borschwing came to this country and wasn't hung, along with Adolf Eichmann, his buddy over in Israel, and check out the network of the Gehlen operation and how Ronald Reagan tapped into it at General Electric as a co-partner, the operation he had with I.G. Farben. The secret government isn't secret. It's documented in maybe 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 books by now. And if those people in the CIA and State Department, Pentagon want to know the beginning of the secret government, they go back to the 1943 in Bern, Switzerland, where William Donovan and Allen Dulles of the OSS were meeting with SS Karl Wolff and the network of Adolf Hitler's top agents, preparing one more time to make that war against the Soviet Union. Now, back to this article, it says President Reagan has constantly expressed his foreign policy positions to the public. He's consulted with Congress, he said, but according to sources, the administration's propensity for secret activities may have had its beginning in October 80th decision by William Casey, then Reagan's campaign manager, to create an October surprise to monitor Jimmy Carter's negotiations with Iran and the release of 52 American hostages. I mentioned last week that Barbara Honegger has a wonderful large front page story, and in these times, and 2 full pages in there, very well documented every sentence and word about the October 80 surprise. And this article says the October surprise group was led by Richard Allen. He then became a national security advisor as thanks for getting Reagan elected and defeating Jimmy Carter by stealing papers from Jimmy Carter's desk. And Richard Allen and William Casey, running the campaign for Ronald Reagan, who was rewarded with directorship of the CIA, thought that Carter might be able to release the hostages before the November 4th election. So one of the group's first acts in 1980 was to meet with a man from Iran who offered to release the hostages to Ronald Reagan. And according to this article, Lawrence Silberman and Richard Allen denied that they went through with the deal. But remember, when they told this reporter they didn't buy that bait, they weren't under oath. And Richard Helms of the CIA and Alan Dulles said, I would lie under oath. And they weren't under oath at all. And also it's important to know that as soon as Ronald Reagan took his oath of office in January 21st, 1981, Israel was sending weapons to Khomeini, and they said we wouldn't do that without the United States telling us. So while they say we didn't go for the bait, they obviously did, and they wanted him as president. And they couldn't shoot Jimmy Carter. They could steal the papers and manipulate the media. They had shot John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King and Adlai Stevenson was poisoned and Hubert Humphrey had cancer and Senator Frank Church had cancer, and there were no candidates except Jimmy Carter to meet, and Nelson Rockefeller died very suddenly in the arms of Megan Marshak with a little spilled wine on the table and the Secret Service out in front. And there was a murder of Mary Jo Kopechne up at Chappaquiddick that eliminated Ted Kennedy. So all they had to do was steal papers that Jimmy Carter was going to say from the National Security Council, and that would be very easy to do. Now, this article says the theft of the Carter papers indicates that congressional persons now link another campaign incident to the same group, the theft of papers of Jimmy Carter's briefings about this matter of planning to release the hostages and what he would say in a debate to Reagan. Why in 1987 are they realizing that this incident is an example, one more example of what Ronald Reagan was doing to become president? There's a 1,000-page government printing office document on the Carter papers naming Robert Gray, Edwin Meese, Richard Allen, and Mr. Max Ugel. The Congress went into that and covered it up like they covered the Kennedy assassination, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, the Watergate, the Korea Gate, the Carter Gate. Those papers have been there for a long time, and now as the House is falling down, they're saying, oh, there's an indication that this secret group stole some papers. It's like Louis Tamsdown, our ambassador to Costa Rica, said he doesn't read the Boland Amendment. He's helping arm the Contras, but he didn't read the law that says he can't. At what point do the agencies have to read what the government printed if they're paid to take care of those matters? Stanford Magazine had an article this month, an interview with John Ehrlichman, comparing Watergate to Contragate. And he mentioned that he'd written a novel that sort of paralleled this Ollie North in the National Security Council. And the Stanford interviewer said, isn't it the usual mode of a military person just to follow orders? Could Ollie do it alone? Wasn't he told what to do? And Ehrlichman said, one question you have to ask is, whose orders are you talking about? We had military men working in the Nixon National Security Council apparatus who turned out to be secret agents for the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, Admiral Thomas Moore. Now, Thomas Moore happens to be on the board of Western Goals that went into the arms of Spitz, Chanell, and Ollie North. So it goes from the Watergate to the Iran-Contra Gate. But Ehrlichman said that when Henry Kissinger took his secret trip to Peking, he had a secretary on the trip, and when Admiral Moore, the Joint Chief of Staff, wanted information, Kissinger would send it back in a diplomatic pouch before President Nixon knew what was said to Chairman Mao or Chu En-lai or the head of Pakistan, Mr. Yahya Khan of Pakistan. Admiral Moore was in a position to read all the information before the president heard about it. My point is people make unwarranted assumptions, Ehrlichman said, about military men who serve the White House staff. We assume they are bright and dedicated, stainless steel servants of the president of the staff they're on. And we forget that the military establishment in this country has its own interests, which may or may not coincide with the president. If the president makes an overture for peace, you've noticed how everything is blown or the peacemakers are killed. And he's giving an example through his own experiences, which is true. The Joint Chief of Staff runs the White House. It runs the National Security Council. and the Pentagon is in the driving seat, and it's not a lieutenant colonel sitting in the old executive office building. It's much bigger. Now, this article continues. Shortly after Reagan's inauguration, the secret campaign group had become a secret administration group, clashing with Congress and the bureaucracy. 6 weeks after Reagan was sworn in February 1981, and apparently over the State Department's objections, William Casey, the new CIA director, had proposed covert support for anti-Sandinista groups who fled after Somoza was out and the Sandinista revolution was achieved in 1979. And this article by Alfonso Chardi is saying that shortly after the inauguration, February 81, they were working on Nicaragua. But in January, they were working on Iran and Libya. But what happened between January 81, when Reagan took the oath of office, and July of 81? We're talking about 6 months. And remember that Ollie North was only on the National Security Council starting at that time. He was new from the Marines. He went to the War College. On July 5th, 1981, 6 years ago, on World Watchers, it's just 6 years ago this week. Actually, 2 days ago, 6 years have passed, program number 500, I listed what happened in the 6 months that Ronald Reagan was president. And keep in mind that this team was planning to overthrow Nicaragua. But the preview of Reagan's presidency began December the 8th, before he was sworn in, when John Lennon was killed. But he was inaugurated in January of 81, and I listed these events just from January to July, not watching his whole administration. February 81, there was an attempted coup in Spain, and Theodore Shackley and Thomas Kleins and the Iran-Contra people have been exposed as having agents working for the DEA, working out of Madrid, Spain. There was an attempted coup to overthrow Spain. In March of 81, there was an attempted coup in the United States, where Alexander Haig, a knight of Malta working with the Italian P2, said, "I am in charge," and George Bush, the former CIA director, would be president, and Reagan was shot by John Hinckley. John Hinckley was represented by the law office of Edward Bennett Williams. The law office of Edward Bennett Williams will be defending Oliver North. The same law office that defended the man who shot Reagan will be the law office representing Ollie North when the hearings begin tomorrow. March 81, there was an attempted coup in Dominica that involved Robert Vesco, Nazis from the South, Alabama, and the Southwest, and in Canada, Nazis and clans. David Duke was involved with that. He wants to run for president now. It involved Robert Vesco and Arthur Lyman, the council asking questions tomorrow. His law office represents Vesco. Willard Zucker, the man who arranges all the finances for the Iran-Contra affair in Switzerland, is a partner of Robert Vesco, and Edward Bennett Williams, the attorney for Oliver North, is also an attorney, or was, for Robert Vesco. And he was going to put in swastikas and Nazis in Dominica in March 81. In May 81, there was the attempted murder of Pope John Paul II. 2 weeks before he was shot, Theodore Shackley of Iran-Contra fame was there, working with Frank Turpel, who was training Ajah, and Michael Ledeen worked with the CIA and Paul Hensey from the CIA on the attempted murder of John Paul II. He survived. May 81 was the murder of the president of Ecuador. March to May was a near coup in Italy when it was discovered that Licio Gelli of the Nazi Party, the Waffen-SS, the fascist, was planning the overthrow of Italy to put in a Nazi dictatorship. He fled to Argentina, but he fled in May of 81. He stopped in Washington in January of 81 to attend the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. In May of 81 was the murder of Zaur Rahman, president of Bangladesh. In June 81 was the near murder, the attempted murder of Algerian Foreign Minister Mohammed Sadiq, who had worked with Jimmy Carter trying to get the hostages released, and with the CIA. In June 81 was an attempted coup in Greece to stop Andreas Papandreou and put the military colonels back in power. In June 81 was an Operation June Bride and a plan to start attacking Libyan President Gaddafi. May of 81 was another plot that surfaced after February to overthrow Spain again. And also in March of 81, there was a sabotage of a plane which Mrs. Indira Gandhi was on, and they caught that sabotage before it happened, and then she died several years later. Don't tell me Ollie North had so much to do. He just was in this office from January, and he's supposed to be the guy that's going to take away the Constitution and put in the military dictatorship. And this team, not secret at all, I was just detailing the shocking events from the time Reagan was shot until just July of 81. That was a sample, and goodness knows we don't know how many more of these things were happening. So also this article in Miami Herald mentions that Oliver North and the National Security Council were making negotiations with Argentine, the Nazi military junta. The CIA flew the Argentine military leader to Washington, D.C., General Leopold Galtieri, to devise a secret agreement in 1981 to use the junta, the death squads, for military officers to train the Nicaraguan freedom fighters that Reagan calls. This is at a time when it was perfectly clear that the Nazis in Argentina were working with the DINA in Chile. Mr. Pinochet came in power when Salvador Allende was murdered September the 11th, 1973. So they had 8 bloody years to know about the missing people, the death squads, burning people alive in the courtyard practically in Argentina, the mothers marching, the children missing, bodies in the river. This was going on, and Colonial Dignidad was a joint operation between Chile and Argentina. And SS Karl Wolff, who designed the floating gas chambers in Germany, came out when Pinochet was put into power by the CIA and the ITT, and wearing the armbands and the swastikas. So we had 8 years of watching Mr. Pinochet, who we put into power, and we were arranging through Ollie North and the National Security Council to fly Galtieri to Washington. And I mentioned several weeks ago that he was training the great freedom fighters, the Contras, until the Falklands War, where he thought that America would defend Argentina. And when we didn't defend them and sided with the British, he had to bring his soldiers home, and then the government was cleaned out. The military men are now back in power, and they have amnesty, most of them, for all of the murders and tortures they did. We flew this Galtieri to Washington, D.C., and Alfonso Ciardi wrote, "It isn't clear if William Casey cleared the plan with President Reagan. What kind of piece of paper do you need to know when the Argentinas are training the Contras?" Ronald Reagan worked with Helene von Damm again. He worked with Otto von Borschwing in the network, and John Paul Getty in San Francisco. He worked with Emmanuel Sinekis from Fairchild and Schlumberger, and he formerly was with ITT. He worked with all these hard Nazis. He knew them. He had planned martial law in California. These are simply clearances on paper, national newspapers giving us a good story, but making apologies as if Ronald Reagan didn't know what the Argentine junta was doing in 1981. And Licio Gelli's down there in Argentina, and he fled there, and he's at Reagan's inauguration. If he didn't know that, he should be out at that point anyway. And to make apologies at this date, it's a little late. And then the article goes on, at this time, during this whole period, 1981, Oliver North moved to the National Security Council from the Marine Corps. He was the liaison between the Federal Emergency Management Agency and the National Security Council, where they produced the plan for the imposition of martial law. This was in 1981, and those who worked with North in the NSC in 81 remember his assignments. And in 1981, when the martial law plan was being generated, this is the time period where William French Smith objected to it, but we didn't learn about it in the media until 1984. They had 3 jolly years to put that together and mind control this president and get into power the things they wanted in power. And this article said the transfer of North from FEMA to Central America came after North took a personal interest in Nicaragua. He knew that the State Department's hands would be tied and the government agencies' hands would be tied after 1984, so he went down there to help the rebels. Their hands were tied because of the mining of the harbor, because the possibility of a confrontation that Congress was not notified, because of tortures in Central America, because talk of drug traffic and so forth and so on. And this article concludes with many of the jobs that North had, a liaison constantly with the Marines and the Special Forces, the National Security Council, the State Department, Office of Public Diplomacy, working with Carl Spitz Chanell, with FEMA, with the Argentine military junta. Well, you'll see Ollie North for the whole week, but if you believe that he did all of this with his little head and the president's head in the sand, then I don't know how you can claim to be sane if you believe that they passed this story on us at this time in history. There's a lot of good material coming out, and I don't think this will hold unless Reagan declares the national emergency in the Gulf. I hope Congress stops him. I hope he doesn't get a provocation. He loves that kind of thing. Well, I'm going to conclude this part of World Watchers now and tell you again, the views expressed in this show are those of myself and do not necessarily or at all reflect, well, maybe not necessarily reflect the views of Kazoo's staff and board of directors. And again, we want to thank Coast Components at 684-1185, the Monterey Bay Area's distributor of electronic components. Thank you for the underwriting grant that brought you this past hour of World Watchers. My name is Mae Brussell. This is the conclusion of the first part of the raw news as it is. And now the second hour, I want to hear from you and see how you think or feel about these things. This is KAZU, Pacific Grove, California, Pacific Grove Radio with a choice.